Now, let's talk about the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU. Come on, you know you want to. Ah, yes, I can hear you do. Yesterday, one Cabinet Minister, Chris Grayling, declared that membership in its current form would be, quote, disastrous, and signalled that he would be a leading figure in the Out campaign. Well, last night, the Chancellor, George Osborne, described himself as a Eurosceptic. But then he said he was confident that David Cameron would secure a renegotiation deal that would allow him and the government to campaign to stay in the EU. Let's have a listen to Mr Osborne's exchange with Evan Davis on Newsnight.
Do you think the referendum is going to settle it?
You know, I think it will for at least a generation, probably for my lifetime.
Some people have talked about a second referendum a few years later.
I don't think that. This is the vote. There's no second vote. Right? This is the vote. This is the crucial decision of our lifetimes. Do we stay in the European Union, a reformed European Union, or do we leave? And
so
I think anyone
and you have another chance to negotiate.
I think anyone who votes out on the assumption that a year or two later you can have another vote to vote back in, I think is being unrealistic about the nature of the choice. And I think it's really important the British people focus on the fact this is the once in a lifetime decision.
So that was the Chancellor last night on Newsnight. The Daily and the Sunday Politics are available to you as well, Chancellor, now you're getting the hang of getting out and about in the TV studios these days. Anyway, the Chancellor thinks that this will be the only referendum on EU membership in his lifetime. He described it as the crucial decision. He was responding to the idea floated by the Out campaign that in the event of Britain voting to leave, there could be a second referendum on whether to accept the new relationship with the EU. But of course, the government has already legislated to allow for a further referendum should there be any transfer of powers from Britain to the EU as the event of treaty change. It's the so-called referendum lock. It was passed way back in 2011. And it came after David Cameron said, never again should it be possible for a British government to transfer power to the EU without the say of the British people. The Act provided for a referendum throughout the United Kingdom on any proposed EU treaty or treaty change which would transfer powers from the UK to the EU. Now, with treaty changes expected long after our referendum, but within the next few years, maybe either side of 2020, as the Eurozone countries head for further unification, and there is a plan to do that, it means that even if the UK votes to stay in, it may not be the final time voters are asked to go to the polls over Europe. Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MEP, Dan Hannan. Welcome. Let's just peel this bit by bit. First of all, the idea that we could vote no in the upcoming referendum, Europe would take fright, give us a ton of things that we hadn't even asked for, and we'd have another referendum on that. Is that a credible scenario?
You know, we've both been around long enough, Andrew, to see what happens when there is a no vote, right? In Denmark, in Ireland, in France. And I think we both know, I think everyone really knows, that Brussels doesn't take no for an answer, at least not the first time. So I think, I'm not saying a second referendum, but I think that if we vote no, that's when they will start to take us seriously. That's when proper concessions will be put on the table. If, on the other hand, we vote to stay, that's it. Then that really is it. You think they're ever going to ask us again? At that stage, we have acquiesced in the whole project that's coming. We've invited them to carry on integrating. If they won't make serious concessions before our referendum, imagine how they would treat us the day after we had voted to stay.
But so are you still holding out the possibility then, if we vote no, of Europe saying, don't go, let's look at this again and have another referendum?
All of the conversations I've had in Brussels for years about this suggest that in the event of Britain voting to leave, some kind of associate membership would very quickly be put on the table, because they've basically worked that out, right? The broad principles of it have been agreed by federalist and anti-federalists in Europe, that we would have a kind of free trade only relationship. My job would disappear, right? We wouldn't be full members, but that we would keep probably the bulk of the economic and financial links to the EU, but we'd be pulling out of the political.
Hasn't the Prime Minister said, or hasn't the government indicated that if it is a no vote, it applies to leave immediately under, I think it's Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, and that just sets the the train on the tracks.
Absolutely, but what do we mean by leave, right? It's very important to stress there is a common market in Europe that embraces EU and non-EU countries. It runs from non-EU Iceland to non-EU Turkey. There are no tariffs, there are no trade barriers within that area. Nobody is talking about Britain leaving that. What we're talking about is withdrawing from the political institutions in Brussels and getting a looser relationship. Now, I had hoped that David Cameron would have negotiated that amicably as part of these talks. Since, for whatever reason, that hasn't happened, and since we're getting basically the same deal as even Alan Johnson, the leader of the Labour Yes campaign, admitted on Newsnight the day before yesterday, it's pretty clear that the only way we can get that kind of associate membership, that slightly looser deal, that free trade, not political merger deal, is by voting to leave.
Can we move on now to an act that I think a lot of people have forgotten about, the European Referendum Act of 2011. It was part of the coalition agreement in 2010. Now, if we vote to stay in the upcoming in-out referendum, and there is nevertheless, because of the needs of the Eurozone, quite substantial treaty change around 2020, maybe 2021, as the law stands, is it your understanding we would need another referendum on that treaty change?
Well, that had been my understanding and everyone else's until I heard the Chancellor last night. By the way, it's a when, not an if. It's very clear that the rest of the EU is going to go to
I accept that.
And by the way, it's very clear from the Five Presidents' report that we will be dragged into quite a lot of that, even if we're not in the Euro.
And the Five Presidents' report is about what needs to be done in the Eurozone and the relationship with the non-Eurozone.
Right, and it talks about having fiscal harmonisation, and it talks about these things applying to all member states, not just to those in the single currency. So it's a question of when that happens. Now, I had assumed that, we would have another referendum because, as you say, it was in the referendum lock.
Not an in-out referendum, though.
Not an in-out referendum, a referendum on not being part of or effectively blocking a future.
As the kind Ireland has every time there's
exactly the kind that Ireland has, that Denmark has. But you've got to listen to what ministers are saying, to what George was saying in the interview, the clip that you just showed, and you think, well, are they now trying to get a mandate now, if we were to vote to stay in, that would effectively carry us through? That they would say, look, we voted for the big principle of the thing, therefore we don't need any future votes. Because that seemed to me what he was saying. He was saying there wouldn't be any more votes.
But the Referendum Act that establishes the referendum we're about to have did not repeal the 2011 Act. And I haven't heard any minister say that in the event of a vote to stay in, they will repeal the 2011 Act. Is that correct?
Right. So this is a political rather than a legal way of tackling it. We've already seen, since the 2011 Act came into effect, quite substantive transfers of power from Westminster to Brussels, particularly in the field of criminal justice and home affairs.
It didn't involve
which didn't
change.
Trigger. Yeah, I mean, because a clever lawyer can usually find a way of saying this doesn't involve the kind of treaty change. Actually, there was an unquestionable treaty change as well to do with the retrospective legalisation of the bailouts. And clever government lawyers said this doesn't trigger the Act. So I think what we're gearing up for is the government saying, if we get a vote to remain in, we will treat that as a mandate for a generation, forget ever voting again. And so people had better be very clear. When we go to vote, we can vote to leave, and we know that there will then be the beginning of a new round of talks, because that's what always happens. If we vote to stay, that's it. It's gone forever. We're on that bus, and we're not going to be able to get off it.
Had you forgotten about the 2011 Act?
It's engraved on my memory forevermore.
I knew.
But no, I have to say I didn't take the same thing from that Osborne interview that Dan Hannan did. I mean, I think he was very clear in saying, look, this is not like haggling in a souk. You can't walk away and expect them to come chasing after you with a better offer.
He's saying
there's
they
only
might.
one out referendum. We're not going to have any more out.
But he's saying they might.
Yes, but I don't think that saying there's no more in-out referendums is the same as saying there's no more referenda ever about anything. It's just saying, look, this is in or out. Of course, there'll be issues further along the line where you turn around and say, do we want this? Do we want that? Do we want the other? But that's not the same as saying, that this is that somehow we've changed our approach completely.
So, not one, not two, maybe three European referenda in the next couple of years.
We haven't had enough referenda of recent times.
I thought you might say
Let's have
that.
one every year, every 6 months.
Good for journalistic trade.
I think there was a great flaw. In fact, there were two flaws of George Osborne's interview last night. One was his complete inability to be able to say by how much migration would be stopped by David Cameron's 4-year ban on benefits and new arrivals. But the second one was definitely no second in-out referendum parking the referendum, future referendum, treaty change. And he has absolutely no way at all of knowing that. I mean, there is absolutely no rules written down anywhere about why you can't have a second in-out. The question, I think, for Dan and the outers, though, is how do you know there definitely will be a second in-out referendum if we vote no for yes? And so you've really got two unknowns fighting each other.
That's the key point. There are unknowns both ways, and there are risks both ways.
Are there known unknowns? And
there are known unknowns, and there are black swans. Right? We know that the EU does not readily accept a no vote. We have seen that every single time. So I think we can reasonably draw inferences from that. But there are huge risks in staying in. Not only in terms of migration, but I think much more in terms of the continuing euro crisis, the way in which we will be dragged into more euro bailouts. You know, one known unknown is if we stay in, how much more of this federalism and how much more of the costs going to be applied to us. If we stay out, we can get a trade rather.
Let me ask just finally this, because we'll have plenty of time to argue the pros and cons on the substantive issue. It is quite clear, I would suggest, that the Prime Minister is going to lead the stay-in campaign.
There needs no ghost, my lord, come from the grave to tell us this.
Indeed, and I haven't even summoned them. But don't you now need someone to encapsulate the out campaign? Who should it be?
I don't know that you do need a single person. Yeah. In the AV referendum, there was no single leader. In the regional devolution referendums, there was no single figurehead. I think there will be a coalition of business figures, industrialists, financiers, trade unionists, of ordinary citizens, of professional associations,
you're saying
and
that
of
you
Labour.
Haven't got somebody. I mean, if Boris...
No, on the contrary, because we've got so many people. Boris and Theresa would...
Every army needs a general.
Is that really true? I mean, in the Scottish referendum, was it wise looking back from a unionist point of view to have made Alistair Darling the sole spokesman of it?
Well,
they have maybe done better. Well, they slipped 10 points during the campaign, right? I'm not sure it isn't better.
Not during the campaign, but they did
This
win.
is a campaign of an elite of politicians, big businesses, mega banks, against the general population. I don't know that it isn't a strength.
Who does the final debate with the Prime Minister?
I mean, that will emerge during the campaign, but I don't think there should be one person doing all the debates from our side.
It won't be Chris Grayling, I assume.
I have no idea. It'll be whoever's the best person on the day.
Right. Very well. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.